was here once before talking about Rochambeau, and I'm here today to talk about appreciating our colonial architecture. I was going to call this talk, the first title that I had up there was Fun with Colonial Architecture, because for me it's a lot of fun. And when Ed asked me to come over to Andover and told me he could get me inside some of the old houses, would I be willing to walk through them and sort of narrate what I saw from the viewpoint of an architectural historian, I just jumped at the chance, because for people like me, the chance to see any old house increases my appreciation and sort of knowledge base of what's out there. Many of our old colonial houses are built on a certain pattern, and yet there are variations from that pattern depending on where they were built and who built them. And so I'm always glad to be able to see new houses. I'm also very appreciative to all the people in Andover that have opened up their house to Ed and me and allowed us to take pictures, because that's a very generous thing. These are people who are owners but also stewards of these resources, and we have to thank all of them for giving us a chance to appreciate these resources. Architecture in the 18th century, as I said, tended to follow kind of a standard plan. And this is the standard plan of a colonial house. You'll see it's built around the most important part of the house, which is the chimney. And the chimney was a massive stone or brick structure that provided not only fireplaces for the various rooms, but also a kind of thermal mass that helped to moderate the temperature. So once you heated up all this stone from fires in the fireplaces, it tended to keep the whole house warm. The houses of our ancestors were fairly drafty. In fact, there was one traveler who came here and felt that in the wintertime you were better off in the wigwams of the Indians than you were in the houses of the English, because the English houses were so drafty. But at any rate, this is where you went in. This is the central entrance. And in the old days, the word porch meant a small room which had the windy stairs to the second story, if it had a second story, and then entrances to the side rooms, which were called the hall and the parlor. In the back was the most important room on a day-to-day basis, the kitchen. Kitchen was where everything took place. The cooking, that was the fire that was kept burning all the time. The other fires were sort of optional depending on whether you were using the room or not. But the kitchen fireplace was where meals were prepared. It's where everyone would gather in the evening to read or converse or whatever. And then off to the side, any room on the first floor of a house was called a bedroom. Any bedroom on the second floor was called a chamber. And over here we have a little room that served the kitchen as a pantry, and it was usually called a buttery. Now, why was it called a buttery? Before you answer, don't say that's where they put the butter or because that's where they made the butter, because that would be too obvious, right? So any other explanations besides the obvious why it was called a buttery? Well, in the old days, the term for a barrel of stuff was a butt. You know, a butt of sherry or a butt of cider. And so this was where you put your barrels of stuff, and therefore it was called the buttery. This was the basic plan of the colonial house. Sometimes they started by building just one room and the fireplace. And sometimes they started by building the two front rooms and adding the back. And many times they built the whole thing at once. This is the typical frame for a colonial house. Unlike our modern houses, which are built of stud walls that are then tilted up and fastened together at the corners and are all nailed together, the colonial house was built with timbers that form a kind of a boxy frame. And then the materials, lath, plaster, clapboards, everything else was attached to that frame. That frame was constructed on the ground. All the joints were constructed on the ground. Any pieces that might not be clear what they were given numbers in Roman numerals. And all of that was done ahead of time. Then they started to erect the pieces and join them together. This is a typical framing scheme for a two-story house, but the one-story house was pretty much just the same thing, but obviously missing one of the stories. These timbers were, for the most part, hand-hewn timbers, because our colonial ancestors were very adept at using tools, one of the key tools being the broad axe. And it would have been a lot more trouble for them to bring a timber of this size to the sawmill, bring it back from the sawmill, and then finish off the ends so that they could be joined, when they could make a square timber with just the axe. And what they would do is they would cut cuts into the side, they'd lay out a line along the top. This is from Eric Sloane's book, by the way, Early American Tools. And then with a broad axe, they'd chip those little pieces that they had made, chip them off. And when they had done one side, they'd flip it over, chip off the other side, and the result would be a hand-hewn timber. This is what we see in our colonial houses. And the expression hewing to the line derives from this technology. Nails were very expensive because all the nails were handmade, and nails were less likely to hold these huge timbers together. So what they would do is they would mortise and tenon join them, and then secure the joint with a whittled peg called a trunnel, which is spelled tree nail, but said trunnel. So this side timber, which is actually a collar tie to a rafter, and it's a sawn piece. You can see the up and down saw that made that piece. This smaller timber extends into this timber, which is a rafter. It extends into that timber quite a ways. That's cut out with a slot called a mortise to receive the extension called a tenon, and then the two are joined by this peg. And that's the way all the joints of the colonial house are put together. By the way, you can see here the marks of those broad axe strokes that created that hewn rafter. And that's an Andover house. I'd like to talk about some of the specific houses, the owners for which Ed has contacted, and tell you just a few things about this. Now, this house is asymmetrical. You see how one side, the chimney is sort of on one side. It's not a symmetrical house. Oftentimes that means that this house started as a smaller house and then was expanded. And if we could get inside and rip down all the plaster, which I'm sure the owner would really love, we very likely would see some discontinuities in the house that would indicate that one side, probably this side, was added to a much smaller, earlier side of the house. I'll blow that up so you can see it better. Another characteristic of these colonial houses, over the front door there was something called a transom or an overlight. And the purpose of that was because that porch that I talked to earlier, that little interior room, would have been completely dark if it hadn't been for those transom lights. So that's very often found. The exterior materials of the colonial house that you can see here, clapboards were the most common in this area. Certain areas, wood shingles were also used, but primarily clapboards. These, by the way, were not always sawn out. Sometimes these were split out of big cedar chunks. The shingles on the roof were always split. So nowadays you go to buy shingles and clapboards, they're sawn. And because they don't respect the grain of the wood like a split clapboard or split shingle does, they tend to warp a lot more than the old-time ones. So maybe in our age of progress, we're not really making progress when we try to use these materials. Remember, this is a culture that knew wood. This is a culture that had vast traditional knowledge passed down from father to son about how to do all these wood-related construction tasks. In the cellar of this house, which is the Benjamin Blackman House on Long Hill Road, dated to 1734, you find the massive stone chimney base. And in each one of these old houses, They have cellars, but it seems like about 75% of the cellar is occupied by the mass of the chimney base. These chimneys are almost always stone in this area because there was a lot of stone available as freestone or as the Bolton stone. So you find that stone predominates in this area. The only time you might find a chimney that's not stone is right above the ridge line, where they may have used the more expensive material, brick. Our colonial forebears were just as concerned about status and impressing their neighbors as we were. So you might have a stone chimney, but if you put a brick top to it, you look just a little bit more modern and perhaps a little bit more prosperous. As I said, the heart of these colonial houses were the kitchens, and where the fire was always kept burning, the meals were prepared, and the people would gather. Here's the kitchen fireplace to this house, the Blackman House on Long Hill Road, and you can see how beautifully preserved it is. And like most of these, it has an oven. Now, a long time ago, they thought that if it had the oven in the back of the opening, it meant that it was an earlier fireplace. But now we come to appreciate that whether you put the oven on the side, as in this house, or in the back of the firebox, it seems like it was more a matter of personal preference than something that adds to the dating of the house. One thing that you can use to date the house, however, is the heaviness of the framing members. And in the earlier houses, you will see a distinct flare to the corner posts and the chimney posts. You'll see that they start out small at the bottom and increase in section as they get to the top, where they have to have other timbers bearing on them. And that's a sign of an older house. Generally speaking, in the 18th century, the houses went from being really overbuilt, bigger, stronger than they had to be, to having more slender frames, as they understood the strength of the wood, because the woods they were using, American chestnut, American oak, were actually stronger than their English counterparts. So as they began to understand the strength of American wood, these heavy framing members began to diminish in size, and you don't find the flare in the later houses. Another thing you see in this house is one of the chief interior finishes. Plaster as an interior finish came in around 1740 and became very, very popular. Before plaster, they finished the interiors with wood boards. These are wide wood boards with beaded edges, and they're tongue and groove joined. And so the whole house interior would be finished with this type of boarding. This principle carried on even after plaster for things like wainscoting and also for back rooms where you could save on the plaster. This is another example of a flared post from this house, but also you can see how this timber is kind of has gotten a sort of finish to it with these edges. That may have been meant to be exposed in the pre-plaster era of this house. Next one I want to talk about is on Bunker Hill Road, and it's the Eliakim Sprague House, dated about 1740, so approximately the same date as that first house that I showed you. It has a more symmetrical facade, suggesting that it was built all in one go. Chimney's a little off-center, so I'll reserve judgment on that. But it's a beautiful sited house. It's a beautifully prepared house. Certainly one of the best preserved historic houses in eastern Connecticut, I would say. And it's like the other house. It's got the clapboard exterior. It's got the transom that lights that porch or hallway inside. It's got the small pane windows. How come old houses had small pane windows? Any thoughts on that? Yes, ma'am.
Money. Expensive.
Expensive because? Where did glass come from?
Imported.
It was all imported. Window glass wasn't made in this country until the 1790s. So any glass that you were going to put in a house had to come from England. Well, naturally, if you're shipping a picture window from England, you got big problems, right? But if you're shipping little pieces of glass, they can be carefully packed. And so the survivability of glass tended to favor smaller pieces. And the bigger the pane of glass, it was more expensive, and not on a proportional basis, but on an exponential basis because of the because it was an imported substance. Here you see the very plain exterior treatment that was common in the colonial period, just some back moldings outlining the door. These dentils, by the way, are probably a later feature that was added to update the house. Again, here's the interior, the fireplace of the chimney, the hearth of the house. A beautifully preserved piece of stonework, very simply executed surround, has an oven. Here's where you could put some hot coals and bake your bread. The interior of this house tends to feature the second kind of woodwork, which is so characteristic of 18th century houses, which is fielded paneling or raised paneling. This is where you construct a covering for the wall with rails and stiles, and then in between are these panels, which are finished with a very, very thin edge and set into those into that framing. So this house has some beautiful paneling, and that's typical of the 18th century. This house also has paneling for the doors that you see here, and also the flare to the corner post that I said was an indicator of earlier rather than later framing. Some of the timbers are exposed in this house, and you can see the broad axe mark that created these hewn timbers. This house also has what I believe to be original ironware. A lot of skills went into making the house. The person that built the frame, cut the frame out, and assembled it was a housewright. There would be other men that would roof it. Many times the roofer was a separate step. But also the blacksmith contributed to this. And this is a handmade latch. And look at this line that goes, this spine that goes down the curved part. How beautiful that is. Simple, but very beautiful. Final house I'd like to talk about is a little later than those two. It's the Daniel White Tavern, built in 1773. And a very historic building because of its associations with the march of the French Army. Not only did the French Army march past this house, but several of the French officers that were here before the march in 1781 to plan the whole campaign with Washington recorded staying here in this tavern in their diaries. So a very historic building, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places. The reason these pictures are black and white is because I actually took these pictures back in 1980 when the owners were gracious enough to have me and list the house on the National Register of Historic Places. Here we see the beginnings of a change to colonial architecture. In place of the huge central chimney that defined the earlier house, there are now two chimneys. Having two chimneys allows you to have a center hall, which is a little bit more elegant, a little bit more formal. And people were thinking about making their houses a little more impressive. And one of the things two things about this plan. First of all, the kitchen has been relocated to an L. This is a one-story L that's attached to the back of the house. Many times the houses in the period 1770 to about 1820, you'll find there is an L off the back for the kitchen. It gets all the cooking and the hot fireplace in the summer. It kind of isolates that from the house. Of course, it's more expensive because if you're going to be living in this part, you've got, two more chimneys and more fireplaces to keep going. But it does provide for a more elegant entrance when you come in the door, and it provides for a straight flight of stairs as you go upstairs as opposed to the winding stairs that are found in so many houses. Another thing about this period is you begin to get a sense of architecture with the capital A. In other words, not just building like your grandfather and your great-grandfather had built, but coming up with decorative items that showed that you were aware of architecture as an art. And here in this house, this is one of the front rooms, by the way. So this would have been the more public, impressive parts of the house. The sides of the fireplace are treated with pilasters, which imitate the fluted columns of ancient architecture. And this is a cornice, and it's got a really complex OG molding above the fireplace. And then above the whole mantle is this molded thing, molded area. Sometimes that contained a landscape painting. Sometimes that contained a mirror. But you can see the whole thing was tending towards a greater sense of elegance, even while they retained some old ideas like the raised paneling. So this house, which is on Hutchinson Road, one of the prettiest roads I know of, has both the older style elements but also some newer forward-thinking elements. Here's some of the raised paneling found in other rooms. And here's the kitchen, which is pretty much traditional. You know, aside from the fact of its location, which is at the back of the L, this fireplace setup, this stonework, pretty much is like the other houses, which date from 40 or 50 years earlier. So it was a real. Houses at the end of the 18th century had forward-looking elements in the most public parts, the most visible parts of the houses, and kind of traditional elements in the back room where they were creating what they were used to.
White's Tavern. Many events have happened. We've had chamber music concerts, we've had open houses, we've had Rochambeau come to visit. Rochambeau really came, the Countess and Count of Rochambeau came in 1976 to visit, to celebrate Rochambeau's visit through the United States for that bicentennial celebration. But also we had many more Rochambeaus come to visit and talk to us in replication of Rochambeau's visit to the United States. We also had Rochambeau's army come to visit many times. We had many dedications, and we had a good time. But I think what I want to talk about mostly is our moving to Andover. We moved to Andover in 1975. In 1976 was the bicentennial. There was a bicentennial commission in Andover. When we bought the house, we had no idea that it had any historic significance other than the fact that it had classical historic architecture, which we fell in love with. We were not in the market to buy a colonial home. We were on our way to Wyndham Airport to buy an air coupe. And if you want to know, can't find Daniel White Inn, you can always find the air coupe in the front of our yard. The house needed a lot of restoration when we bought it. Starting with the upstairs, the thing that was in perfect condition were the two walls that opened up and went into a dance hall. So that was in perfect condition. However, there was a room in the back that was all the woodwork was painted black. We had to clean that up. When we walked into what is now the keeping room, that was gutted. There was a railroad tie up over that fireplace. That lovely beehive fireplace had a railroad tie with a gun on it. It looked like Bonanza. So we knew there was no ceiling, and there was an electrical light bulb in the middle of the room. So we knew we had our work cut out for us. When we came back from the airport, we came down Hutchinson Road from Route 6, and we saw the front of the house. I fell in love. The front of the house faced Post Farm with these beautiful cows and this wonderful pastoral scene. And so I had to get the address and the telephone number of the agent that was selling the house. Called the agent, made arrangements to see the house, and first thing we saw was the keeping room needing all this work. There was an orange wire across the floor, a bare electric light, no ceiling. The eaves were open, and you could tell that there had been a plaster ceiling. So I went out and bought my trusty Connecticut, Kelly's book of early Connecticut homes, and we followed all the beams to close in our keeping room. As it turned out, not the person we bought the house from, but the people that owned the house prior to that, came to visit me, and they said, "This is exactly the way the room was." They were so relieved. They were happy about that. But in the meantime, Phil Brass got in touch with us and told us about I don't know if any of you know, Phil Brass used to be the town historian. And he got in touch with us to tell us that there would be a Bicentennial Commission meeting. So we went to it, and then he proceeded to send my husband a letter and tell us about the Daniel White Inn. Well, the previous owner had brought up this piece of board that said the house, and had some dates on it, and it said that the house was a Revolutionary War camp. I didn't care. I wanted the house anyway. But then to find that might have had historical significance was a really important point in my mind. And so then we joined the Bicentennial Commission. We had a lot of good times. There were a lot of great people. There was Alice Yeomans Moe. There was Betty and Phil Brass. There was Doris and John Hutchinson. There was, I hope I'm not going to forget anybody. There was Peg Talbot. There was, anybody remember anybody else? No? Peg Talbot. Well, it escapes me. Oh, John and Doris Hutchinson, Charlie Phelps. There were so many of them, and they all wanted to contribute to telling us about the house. The previous owner had told us that had lousy records, that there had been owner of Binghamton had owned the house, which we have a stone that says H. Binghamton, 1893. That's in my den. Then he told us about Bogardus that owned our house, and then he told us about Gurley Phelps. Well, I was impressed. I had heard of Gurley Phelps. I wasn't sure of what he'd done, but wow, we're in a famous house. And then when we came to visit various citizens, like the Steens, they said, "Oh, you bought the Gurley Phelps house." So they were happy to see that we bought the Gurley Phelps house and that we were restoring it, and everything was fine there. Then we had the Bicentennial picnic. I could talk all day. I love to talk. I'm going to close my program with telling you that Doris Hutchinson gave me a recipe for her soft molasses cookies that were her mom's. And she made these cookies for our Bicentennial picnic in 1976. And then Betty Brass gave me a recipe for 1,000 beans and a meatball. And that was from Phil Brass's, our historian's, book signing. So I'm willing to share my recipes. And I want to tell you that I'm not the owner of the Daniel White Inn. I'm the caretaker. It doesn't belong to us.
Peter and I own the house on Bunker Hill. It's a 1.5-story cape, and we're no taller than 5'7", and if you paint the ceiling, it's right here. So it's very easy to paint. That's in the upstairs. We moved here in 1990 when Alice Yeomans Moe, our Peter's aunt, went to a retirement community, and she bought it in 1956. Do you want to say anything?
What Dorothy is referring to is in the 40s and into the 50s, the house was owned by people named Sherwood, and they didn't live there. There was no indoor plumbing, there was no electricity in the house. And I love that house. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Catherine Yeomans, underline Hutchinson. This becomes important in the end. I had for years told Mr. Sherwood if he ever decided to sell the house to please let me know. So he called up one day and he said, we're gonna be out there Saturday, if you are interested in the house, come up and let's talk. So I rushed around and I searched the title on the property, and I took a look at all the comparable sales, which there weren't any. But I had a pretty good idea what the property was worth when I went to see him. And he said, yes, we're going to sell it. And I said, how much do you want for it? He says, how much do you want to pay? I hate that. So my research indicated that the house was worth between $13,000 and $14,000. This was 1950. So I offered him $12,500. And he says, I think I need to get a little bit more than that. Keep in mind, I was perfectly prepared to go to 15 for it, because the lovely site that I had 60 acres at that point. And so he says, well, I'm going to go back and talk this over with my wife. The next thing I know is that I hear from my dad, who is also a Yeomans, that my aunt Alice Yeoman's mom, and that belongs to Washington. So I was storming up to the Sherwood house the next time I saw him there, which is about a week or two later. I said, Mr. Sherman, I thought you and I were negotiating for this house, and then I was waiting for you to get back with a counter offer for the property. And he said, well, your aunt and uncle came into the apartment and they told us that you couldn't afford it. So that is why Dorothy is here to talk today.
At church this morning, I asked her if we should.
The person who said sounds like Alice, absolutely right.
At church this morning, I asked her if we should tell the story, and she said, absolutely. So Alice Moe moved there in 1956, and until then it had no indoor plumbing. There is an outhouse, a three-holer, and they added the electricity at that point. So that house has been passed down, and it did not need renovation other than to put in the plumbing and the electric. I went to a lot of museum houses to see, well, what do they put between the wide board floors, have a big crack, and I was wondering what went in between. But all the houses had new floors, so I was like, oh, well, I have the old floors.
Yeah.
That must be pretty neat. So we moved here in 1990 when she was going into a retirement home. We also loved the forest. I think it was 85 acres before the state took some of the property. And they just cut off the whole back piece that goes to Bear Swamp. But we loved the forest. To try to preserve the house against fire, we have a wood boiler out in a shed, and the heat goes underground to the house. So if anybody wants to know about that, they can ask Peter. So we could never have lived here with all of our 5 kids because it's small. There's 2 bedrooms upstairs, and it's got a galley kitchen. The upstairs where we have a bathroom now was the cheese room. That's about all I know about that. I'm afraid I have to be careful what I say because Scott knows so much more about the history that I'm sure he'll correct me afterwards. Our house was also on that bicentennial house tour, and that's the last tour that we've had. It is a strong house. There isn't any insulation, but in a hurricane, you know, you just know it's going to stand tall. And let's see. one last little note, because a lot of people here do know our Aunt Alice. But after when she moved out, she pretty much picked up her pocketbook and left. So it was 10 years trying to get rid of her stuff because she said she'd be back for it at any moment. That included all the books in every bookcase and glassware. And some shelves even had a big sign, "Do not touch." So about 6 months later, I said, "When are you going to get this stuff? I need to move my things into this galley kitchen." And she says, "Oh, that was for the movers." But I put a coat of varnish on the floors because they were not in good shape. And she came in one day and said, "Well, that's not exactly, authentic." And so by now I've been in Connecticut a year, and I said, "Well, neither is that 1956 bathroom."
I'm the newcomer in town. I've only been in town for about 25 years. But same with me when I wasn't really going to buy that house. I went by it and I saw a sign and ended up going in and liked it. And Ed asked me to talk about what it's like living in an old house, and pretty much that's what I'm going to concentrate on is the upkeep. It's very difficult with an old house. You just can't run down to Home Depot and buy a window. I had the special order windows, the hardware that you showed us. I mean, if I go to an antique shop at the Cape or something, you're always looking for hardware, lights. It's just a lot of upkeep. I remember when I was younger, I would go to work, come home, mow the lawn, and after dinner, do some repair on the house. And now I don't even want to mow the lawn when I get home. Basement, thing like the basement, a stone basement. I miss having a concrete basement. I mean, you don't have the opportunity to go down and put a rec room in. But it's a nice wine cellar. It stays cool, and it's workable. My son used to be afraid. It reminded me of like a Newgate prison or something. It stays nice and cool down there, but actually it stays warm in the winter. That's odd. Closet space. I guess people years ago did not have the opportunity to run to the mall and buy an extra set of pants or shirts because very little closet space, so they must have not had a lot of clothing. Let's see. It's 2010 minus the 1734. If they built that this summer, it would have been 276 years old. So it's been there through a lot of storms, a lot of families, a lot of history there. I just thank you two or everybody on this historical because if you go and build a modern house, it's unique. Well, these homes are also unique. There's 60 some odd in Andover, and I'd hate to lose any one of them. And thank you.